We'll be getting started here in about 5 minutes. If everyone can see my slide deck on the screen, if you could raise your hand for me. Excellent, thank you. We'll be getting started here in about 2 minutes. Okay, everybody, let's go ahead and get things kicked off here today. Good afternoon to everybody. I'm actually here on the East Coast of the U.S., so it's about 3:30 in the morning for me. But I hope you guys are having an awesome afternoon there in India. Before we move on to the next slides and code demos and stuff, I just want to make sure everybody can actually see my slide on the screen. I asked this a couple minutes ago, but just to double check. If you can see my actual slide that says, welcome to the Angular 5 webinar, we will be starting shortly. If you can see that, if you could raise your hand, I'd appreciate it. All right, looks like we got a few hands raised there. Excellent. Okay, so the way the webinar is going to work here is that I'm going to do a slight presentation of a slide deck. Then we're going to do some coding, and then we're going to be taking some questions at the end. The way that questions work is that in the webinar software on your desktop, you should see a box for questions. If you could put your questions in the box as we go along, then when we get to the end, I will actually take a look at those questions and then do my best to answer as many as I possibly can. We should have a fairly high number of people attending this today, so I may not be able to answer everybody's questions, but we'll do our best to answer as many as possible. We're going to be going until about 3:30 p.m. Indian time. It's 2 o'clock now, so it's about an hour and a half or so for walking through content. Most of that time will be spent doing live coding, but the first part will start off with a slide deck, followed by the coding, then followed by the question and answer part of the webinar. All right, so let's get started with getting started with Angular 5. My name is Eric Greene. I do a lot of training with both Wintellect and Wintellect Now. Wintellect is the consulting arm of the organization. They do consulting, training, programming, that type of thing. And then I also do training with Wintellect Now, which provides a ton of videos, excellent videos, I might say, for you to be able to have on-demand training when you want to learn some type of new topic. Big topics that we cover, in addition to things like Angular and React, are things like machine learning and Azure and big topics like that. So if you have an interest in learning more things online through on-demand training, or you need consulting or programming help, Wintellect and Wintellect Now are probably one of the two best organizations in the world to be able to help you out with that. So I definitely enjoy working with them, and they're a great group of people to work with. So in our session here, we're going to do a quick overview of Angular 5. We're not going to spend a tremendous amount of time looking at slides. We're going to try to jump into the code as quickly as possible. Then we're going to code up an actual Angular 5 application. So I said to myself, in an hour, what can we accomplish? And we're going to take a look at the Angular CLI, take a look at how to work with modules and components. We'll take a look at how to connect to REST services and use the HTTP client provided by Angular. We'll take a look at working with services, reactive forms, component composition, and then finally at the end, we'll take a bunch of questions. So let's go ahead and get started here with a quick little overview of Angular 5. What exactly is Angular 5? What problem does it solve? So Angular 5 is an HTML, CSS, JavaScript-based application framework. Yes, hold on one second. I've got a technical question here I need to answer for somebody. Okay, now back to my slide deck. One of the organizers asked me for a link to the webinar, so I needed to give that to them. So let's continue on. So Angular 5 is an HTML, CSS, JavaScript-based application framework. What does that mean? Well, Angular 5 is all about solving the problem of how to build user interfaces. And when we say user interfaces, we don't just mean web browsers. We mean things like native applications and desktop applications. But for the most part, for this demonstration, we're really talking about web browsers. So HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Those are the three languages that have powered web browsers for the past 20 years. HTML is all about basically defining the semantic structure of a web page. CSS is all about defining the presentational aspects of the web page. And then JavaScript provides the logical functionality for manipulating that web page. Angular actually involves all three of those. Angular is going to leverage the power of JavaScript through a language called Typescript, which gets transpiled to JavaScript. And then HTML and CSS are going to be leveraged in terms of templating and animations and stuff like that. Now, Angular 5 itself, as I mentioned, is actually cross-platform. This is not like the old days of things like Angularjs or Jquery or Backbone, where those are libraries or frameworks that are really just for a web application, a traditional web application. Instead, Angular 5 can be used for web apps, desktop apps, and native apps. In terms of desktop applications, it can be used, for example, with the Electron platform, which is really a combination of the Chromium web browser and Node to build cross-platform desktop apps. It can also be used with native applications through something called NativeScript. And so it allows you to actually use HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to build UIs that will run literally on an iOS device or an Android device. Speed and performance. A big part of Angular is the concept of ahead-of-time compilation. If you've worked with older versions of Angular or even just older templating systems, you would know that a lot of the processing of the template actually occurs on the client side. Well, in the latest versions of Angular and the latest versions of the CLI, they actually support ahead-of-time compilation out of the box. And that's basically where, if you want to think of, without getting into all the details, the compilation process being divided into 5 separate steps. In older versions of Angular, 4 of those steps were done on the client and 1 step was done on the server. Of course, that means more work for the client. In recent versions of Angular, 4 of those steps are done on the server 1 time as part of the application deployment, and then 1 step is done on the client. And that means you get even faster UIs being built using this ahead-of-time compilation. Also, there's been work in Angular 5 to support things like web workers and server-side rendering to make web pages load up even faster. One of the big, huge benefits of Angular 5 is the amount of tooling that's available for it. Everything from the Angular CLI, which is what we're going to be using to build our application here shortly, tons of third-party components, lots of them. All types of third-party UI libraries you can incorporate into this. And there's literally support in almost every popular editor for working with Angular applications. So when you're working with Angular, you're going to get a really good development experience because it is so popular. It's promoted by Google. You're going to get a great experience in most of your development tooling that you're going to work with. Now, Angular is actually the full development story. It's not just a couple of little UI widgets here and there, but you've got testing, animations, accessibility, all types of cool things like that. All right, now, when we refer to Angular 5 as a framework, what we mean is it's more than just a little widget library like a React. React just focuses on displaying some type of UI component on the screen, whereas Angular brings a lot more pieces into the mix. It's going to give you a module system for being able to organize your application into modules. It's going to provide you something called services where you can put your business logic and where you can store your data that you've downloaded from a web server, what have you. It's going to provide different built-in formatting constructs called pipes that will be used with your templates to format the output data. It brings in things like RxJS, so you can do reactive programming as part of the actual framework itself. Has routing included. You can do all of these things in a React application, but you have to have a bunch of libraries in addition to React. Whereas from an Angular 5 approach, to use the description of the Angular 5 team, it's a batteries included way of doing things. So you don't have to go out and buy the batteries separate from the thing that you're purchasing. It actually comes with the batteries. Well, that's how Angular 5 works. Angular 5 comes with all the basic building blocks that you would need to build a complete UI. And that could be for web apps, desktop apps, and even native applications. One really important aspect of working with Angular is what I call component-driven development. Now, component-driven development, of course, is not limited to Angular. It can be done with things like React or even the older Angularjs 1.5 and above. But the idea behind component-driven development is that instead of building one big, huge UI, like one big monolithic template, you can actually divide your UI into smaller pieces, and then you can reuse those pieces over and over again. and then you could take those smaller pieces and compose them together to make bigger UI screens. This is a huge benefit to building applications because it really does maximize the reuse of code. It makes it easier to unit test things. You can build components and stuff that are targeted to a particular purpose. You can't really do all those things when you build these big monolithic templates. So that's one nice thing about component-driven development. Now, Angular actually does this whole component thing like completely from the ground up. So it's really the big part of working with UI stuff is working with these components. And then one of the really great things about it is, in addition to working with a lot of Angular 5, I work with a lot of React as well. And the ideas and principles that go into working with components are really the same with React as they are with Angular, and the same with Angular as they are with React. So when you master all the different parts of working with components, it's actually knowledge you can take to other frameworks and libraries with you. So it's not like a one-time use type of thing. You can actually use that in other places. All right, so we mentioned that it's cross-platform, works in web browsers, all the modern web browsers. For older web browsers, there's polyfills and stuff that will be loaded up to support various features that maybe only the very latest fully support natively. We'll have polyfills to support it in older web browsers. The Electron framework is that the desktop environment that I was describing a few moments ago, where you have a Chromium instance, which is Chrome's open source version, and Node on the back end are basically put together to be able to create cross-platform desktop applications. So you could use Angular for that. Native iOS and Android applications through the use of NativeScript. You also have server rendering for the creation of universal web applications, isomorphic applications that can run either client-side or on the server side. Now, Angular has lots of parts because it is, in fact, a framework. We're going to be looking at 4, well, I've outlined 7 parts here. You could probably organize this list with either additional detail or less detail. But of those 7 parts that I've outlined, we're going to be looking at 4 of them in this presentation. We're going to be taking a look at modules, components, services, and forms. The other parts, things like pipes, routing, and custom directives, we won't have a chance to cover, but those are also important parts of working with Angular as well. Modules basically allow us to take all of these different parts that we're looking at and kind of put them together in a group and organize them within our application. Components allow us to actually design the user interface that'll be presented to the user. So when you think of components, think of things like HTML and CSS, and then the immediate logic that you apply to those particular UI pieces. Services, that's going to contain our business logic and our temporary store for data, stuff like that. Forms, for collecting and validating data. So Angular has a really, really rich form system that makes it really easy to work with forms in your application. Doing everything from actually collecting the data from all the forms for you, but also being able to validate data, stuff like that. Then the other 3 parts that we're not going to look at are going to be pipes. And pipes basically do formatting of data. So for example, you could apply a currency pipe, and you could format the currency for rupees if you wanted to. Or if you were in the US and we put the month before the day, or if you were in Canada, you put the day before the month. So you can do all types of formatting of your output data. Then we have routing. And routing is basically the ability to swap views, really swap views based upon the URL, although in some routing systems the URL is kind of optional, but you can basically swap views. And then finally, custom directives, which are really nothing more than just, because components themselves are also directives, they're just a special kind of directive. But directives in Angular basically are used to manipulate DOM objects, more or less. There's also some data parts to it as well. But basically, it's applying some type of little marker to the DOM structure, and then either adding elements, removing elements, manipulating a single element. And like I said, there's also some other data pieces that are going to go into all of this. Now the question is, what about React? Everybody always asks me. Right now in the marketplace, when working with UI frameworks, the two big competitors are going to be Angular and React. When I go and teach at different places, they're either a React place or they're an Angular place. React is excellent. I love React. React is awesome. I love Angular 5 as well. Angular 5 is awesome. Angular is more about providing that batteries included framework experience, whereas React has to be combined with other libraries. So it all depends upon what you're doing. If you have a lot of your own opinions on what libraries you should be using, then you might favor React because you can pick and choose how to put those together. If you're okay with Angular kind of telling you how to do things, then you can go with Angular and go with its framework. Now with React, you end up with a lot more boilerplate code. You end up with a lot more work on your end to put all the pieces together. In fact, one of the demonstrations that I do in my classes when I'm teaching is that we'll build a little simple application as part of the first day. In a React class, building that application literally takes the whole first day, if we even finish it. In Angular classes, we can usually finish that whole application in half a day, maybe 3/4 of a day. But it's a lot faster to develop with Angular because it has all the parts and pieces included. We can get it done a lot faster. When you work with React, because you have to put all the pieces together yourself, it does take more time. But it just depends upon your philosophy of the best way to build web apps. In either case, both of them are excellent libraries and frameworks to work with. Also, when we work with Angular, we're going to be using TypeScript. While TypeScript isn't a requirement, I'm not really aware of anyone that does Angular programming not using TypeScript. I'm not aware of anybody using just plain old JavaScript to do it. And that's because of some of the things like decorators and stuff that Angular kind of requires. You can do it with plain old JavaScript, but it's a lot more work. Well, with React, you can also use TypeScript for programming. So whether you're choosing React or Angular, you can use TypeScript for both. And I always recommend in an enterprise environment, go with TypeScript. TypeScript makes your life so much easier, especially if you're coming from a Java or .NET background. Having the strong typing capabilities of TypeScript, like you're going to see here in our little demonstration, makes things a lot easier, especially on large to medium-sized development teams, especially on projects where you're not coding every part of it. So you can't know all the API details across the board. Makes it a lot easier to work with JavaScript through the use of TypeScript. Okay. So what we're going to do now is we're going to dive in to our coding demonstration. I've put together 7 demonstrations for you. We should be able to get through all of them in the time allotted, plus be able to have time for questions at the end. And if we need to go a little bit past 3:30, I don't know if you guys can hang around, but I can hang around a little bit longer. So I can hang around a little bit after 3:30 to take some additional questions if we need to. The demonstrations are basically going to take us from having nothing to having a complete application. All of the code that you're about to see is going to be put up on GitHub. So after the webinar is over, later on today, Eastern Time, you'll get a link to the GitHub repository, as well as the slide deck that you just saw here. Also, I did make the slide deck available via the handouts if you want to download it from there as part of the webinar. But you will get access to all of this source code, and you can then go back and review that as part of your review after the webinar is in fact over. So let's go ahead and dive into this and get started. So I'm going to drag our thing down here. All right. So here's our little terminal window, and what I've done ahead of time is I've already installed the Angular CLI, but with the desire to kind of show you everything, I'm not going to reinstall it, but I am going to show you the command to install it. So if you did not have the Angular CLI already installed, you would want to do 2 things. First, you would want to install Node.js. So if you're going to do Angular programming, you're going to need to have Node.js installed. So here's Node. I recommend probably going with version 8 if you're going to be building a new application. If you're just learning stuff on your own, go with version 9. Okay? Now, if you're coming in here, we're going to install the Angular CLI. So if we did that, we'd say npm I, and you could actually expand that to say npm install -g, that means for global, at Angular CLI. I'm not going to reinstall it now. I already have it installed. No need to risk breaking it. But you can actually run this command here from your terminal, and this will work in both Mac and Windows and Linux. So even though I'm doing everything from a Mac, pretty much everything should work fine on Windows and Linux as well. And this will install something called the Angular CLI globally that I can then use from a command prompt. So what exactly is the CLI? The CLI is a command line tool provided by the Angular development team that really makes developing Angular applications much easier. One of the big complaints you'll hear about modern JavaScript development is that you basically have to be an expert at JavaScript just to simply get a Hello World application up and running. And that is actually mostly true. And the reason for that is because all of the development tooling, things like Webpack and transpiling with Typescript and configuring other linting tools and unit testing, all of that stuff has very complex, large APIs, and they're APIs that change fairly often. So you have to know how to put all those parts and pieces together to get a simple application up and running. Well, the CLI solves that problem. So instead of having to become a JavaScript ninja to be able to do Hello World, we can simply come in here and say ng new, and then we'll give our Angular application a name. We'll just say ng5, not ng3, ng5 demo. And that's actually going to go out and create a folder called ng5 demo, and then it's going to go out over the internet and download all of the packages and stuff that we're going to need to be able to run our demonstration. So we'll give it a second to download this over the internet. You can also see here it created a ton of files. These are all the files that you would have had to have created if you were doing this on your own and not using the CLI. So we have a bunch of packages that have been downloaded, and our project has been created. So we can actually change into the project folder here, and you will see we have a bunch of files that were created. You will also see a node modules folder that contains all of the packages that were downloaded by the CLI. Now, once we've created our project, we want to start editing it. In my opinion, the best text editor in the marketplace in terms of modern editors is Visual Studio Code. Now, Visual Studio Code is not the regular Visual Studio that runs on Windows and you use it for .NET applications and stuff like that. Visual Studio Code is an editor built on the Electron framework that runs totally cross-platform. It's completely open source. You can install it anywhere. So if you have an interest in Visual Studio Code, you can go to code.visualstudio.com. And if you load this up, you'll actually see Visual Studio Code. This is a picture of it right here. It actually looks a little bit like Sublime and Atom, if you have any familiarity with those. Okay? And yes, for those of you who love VI out there, there is a VI mode for it. So you can still have your VI keyboard shortcuts while using a modern editor with a built-in terminal and a nice little file browser window. So we'll come into here, and we're going to say open -a Visual Studio Code, and we'll open up our editor here. So one thing I really like about Visual Studio Code over other editors is that when I zoom in and out, you'll notice not only does the editor window get bigger and smaller, but the actual file window gets, the actual file folder listing gets bigger and smaller too. For example, Atom doesn't do that. The little files to the side don't get bigger and smaller. And so when you're doing presentations, which I do a lot of with my teaching, it's very helpful to be able to show people the file window over here so I can explain different files and stuff that we're making use of in terms of working on our application. In addition to the file window over here, which is great for working with JavaScript apps, you'll also want a built-in terminal window. And so by hitting Control backtick here, I was able to open up a terminal window. And inside of here, I can do all the types of operations that you would expect to be able to do inside of a terminal window. So we have that here. Now, just to make sure that everything kind of installed correctly for our application, I'm going to go ahead and run npm start. npm stands for the Node Package Manager. There's an alternative package manager called Yarn, which is also very popular in the JavaScript node development world. I'm using NPM 5, which has a lot of the benefits that come with using Yarn, so I'm making use of NPM here. Then I'm going to go ahead and say Npm Start and hit Enter. And you're going to see that this is going to start to fire up our application. Looks like I've got my port already in use. Hold on 1 second here. All right, let's fire this up again. I had my port 4200 already being used up. Now you can take a look here. A lot of stuff happened as part of loading up our application. All right, so we have all of this stuff loaded up. We have Webpack here processing all of our JavaScript code on the server side, and then basically serving it up for us. You do not have to be a master of Webpack in order to do this Angular development using the CLI. I do recommend, though, if you do go down the path of doing JavaScript development, that you do in fact learn how things like Webpack work. But you don't have to do that to get things up and running. That's one of the nice benefits of the CLI. Now we'll go ahead and load up Chrome. So here's Chrome. We'll go to our browser and say localhost 4200. And you can see here's the little application that we get when the whole thing loads up. So we didn't have to code any of this. This is all provided to us as part of just doing the installation and downloading everything. But this will be the starting point that we're going to start with in terms of putting together our application. Now, when working with the CLI code, you'll see there's a source folder here. This is where all of our code is going to go, and we're primarily going to be working in the app folder here and any subfolders that we create for it. And this is where we'll actually put all of our Angular code that we're going to work with. Now, the CLI does more than just generate that initial project. The CLI will also enable us to add additional things to our project. The addition of additional things is called generation. We're going to generate something. So actually, the first thing that we're going to generate as part of our new project is we're going to generate a module. So we're going to say ng, G is short for generate, module, and then we're going to create a module called CarTool. So here's our CarTool module right here. So we're going to hit enter and let that get created. You will see underneath the app folder we now have this CarTool folder with cartool.module.ts. We've now set up a module where we can take all of our different parts that we're going to create and logically organize them here within this module. You can see a ton of code was created for us here. It pulled in ng module for setting up modules, the common module, which is going to make some of the directives and stuff available to us in a platform-independent manner. And then we have the initial syntax for importing that common module and then exporting our actual CarTool module class right here. Now the next step is once we have that module, we need to go ahead and create our very first component and then be able to make use of that component and display it in our page. Okay? So to do that, we are going to type in another command. ng, we'll just say G this time though, instead of typing out all of generate. Instead of a module, we're going to create a component. Remember, a component is that UI piece that you see on the screen. car-tool / components / car-home, and we're going to assign it to the module car-tool. So we'll go ahead and hit enter. Now you'll see it's going to create a components folder over here, and inside of that we're going to have car-home, and it's going to create a bunch of files for us. So the files that we're going to have are, we're going to start off with a class file here for our component. You can see it kind of filled out a lot of code for us. We'll have an HTML file for our template, and then we'll have a CSS file that our styles will go into. We're not really going to do any styling in this particular demonstration, but if you wanted to have styles associated with the component, you could add them here. And then, of course, you can also do your unit testing, so it gives you an initial unit testing file that you can work with. Now, what we're going to do here is we're going to make use of this car home component inside of our actual application and then display it on the screen. To do this, oh, one other thing too, by the way, you'll take a look here, it actually registered our car home component with our car tool module. So this little command here, ngg component car tool -m car tool, it did a fair amount of work in terms of saving us from typing a lot of code. I encourage you, though, even for the generated code, to make sure you go back and understand what it's doing. One of the big mistakes that people make when using tools like this is they kind of become dependent upon the tooling and they don't really understand the code that's being created. It's always important to understand the code that's being created. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to come over to here, and we're actually going to import this module that we've created into our main application module so that we can actually use the car home component on that initial application page that loads up. So we'll say import car tool module from /car-tool/car-tool.module. All right. So you saw as I was typing that out there, I got some pretty good IntelliSense. You'll be really amazed at the IntelliSense that we're going to get as we build the application. This is one of the reasons I love using Visual Studio Code with TypeScript, because you get this really nice IntelliSense experience, which can make your life a lot easier when putting all of this together. So now that we've imported car tool module, we want to take car tool module here, and we want to add it to our imports like that. All right. And so now we have that being imported there. Next thing we need to do is, now that we have our car tool module being imported, we actually need to come over to our car tool module, and we need to export our car home component so that our application can actually use it in a template. So we'll come into here, and we're going to say exports, and then we're going to do our car home component. And so what this will do is make the actual component itself available for usage inside of our templating system. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to hop down to our app component HTML, and we're going to take all the content in here and delete it and replace it with car home. There we go. So let's go ahead and save that. We'll come back down here and restart our application. Okay, so now that we've restarted, let's come back over to Chrome. Let's reload this. And let's see, do we have an error? We have an error. Okay, so let's take a quick look here at our error. Template parse error, car home is not a known element. One of the nice things about working with Angular is we actually get some really nice error handling and really nice error messages in our browser. Now the reason why it can't find car home is because a prefix was added to our element. If you go back over to car home component.ts, you will see something here. You will see app-car home. That app dash is what's known as a prefix. That prefix was automatically added by the CLI software so that our components can have like their own little namespace in a sense, so it won't conflict with other things. For our little application, though, I don't really want to have this prefix. I want to get rid of it. So if I come in here and delete it, you'll now see I get a red underline. The reason I'm getting a red underline is that one of the things that we get with Visual Studio Code and using the CLI is something called TSLint. TSLint is a linter for TypeScript. And what it'll allow us to do is actually to have a way of validating our code to make sure we're following our best practices when coding our application. And so we can actually see things like this before we even go to run the code. So what I want to do is I want to modify my configuration to be able to support not having prefixes. To do that, I can come down here, and the first thing I'm going to want to take a look at is the .angularcli.json. This is the configuration file for Angular CLI. So if CLI is doing something that you don't want it to do, or you want to change the configuration, this would be the configuration file where you can do that. For example, you see down here on line 20 we have prefix. I'm going to come in here and take out app and save it. So that gets rid of the app prefix. But I still have my tslint problem. tslint is configured in another file called tslint. We'll search for app here, and you'll see that for the directive selector and component selector, it's looking for this app prefix as part of the configuration. So I'll come into here, and I'm going to get rid of this, and I'll save that. All right. So far, so good. So now I've updated my tslint and my Angular CLI, and take a look. Now my error message for car home has gone away. But I'm still not quite done yet. You may have noticed over here that in our app component HTML, we have this little green underline here underneath our car home. Now the reason we have that is that I actually have an extension installed in Visual Studio called HTML hint. If you come over here and click this little box, you'll actually see a list of all the extensions that I have installed. And I have a fair number of them installed, everything from Python to PHP, VS Code icons, some stuff for working with the Vue library, and then you have tslint. If you scroll up, though, you'll see where I have HTML hint installed right here. Because I have HTML hint installed, it's actually trying to lint my HTML for me. Now, the CLI doesn't come with anything for working with HTML hint. This is just something I have installed. So what I typically do is I'll come in and create a configuration file called .html hint rc. And then I've got a configuration. I'm not going to type the whole thing, and I'll just copy and paste it for you. Configuration like that. There we go. Save that, and now if I come back over to here, you will see that I now have my linting is working properly for my HTML. So one of the cool things about working with code is you have all these different extensions that you can put in to actually improve your development experience, such as in this case, working with a linter for your HTML code. So there we go. So we've got our car home, we have our hinting set up, we have our selector fixed here, updated our tslint and our Angular CLI stuff, and we're exporting our car home component. We are importing it over here, and we should be able to head back over to our web browser now and reload, and you can see car home works. So it actually loaded up the content of the initial car home template, and there we go. All right, so that concludes our first little demonstration that we had here for getting an Angular application up and running. We've created a new app using the CLI. We created a module and a component. We also customized our development environment by adjusting some of our CLI settings, as well as updating our linters, specifically tslint and HTML hint. All right, so for our next demonstration, we're going to walk through displaying a table of car data. Oh, and by the way, for those of you who are watching the clock, as we're going through this, if we end up not getting through all 7 demonstrations, I will put the code for all 7 demonstrations up on the GitHub site. So even if we don't quite get through all 7, you'll have all of the code for all 7 that you can go back and reference later. Okay, so jumping back over to here, let's go ahead and set up our ability to display some data. The first thing that we're going to need to do to be able to display data is we're going to need a REST service. Now, we could go off and build our own Java or Python or .NET-based REST service and spend a lot of time doing that. Or we could make use of a tool called JSON Server. JSON Server is going to allow us to basically spin up a REST service in like 30 seconds or less. To do that, we're going to need to create a file here called db.json. And I've got some initial car data that I'm going to drop into that file here real quick. Just copy that, paste it. So there's our db.json data right there. Now we need to actually install the REST service itself. So to do that, we're going to come down here. We're going to say npm. We can do I for short for install. And we're going to save this as a development dependency. And we're going to say json-server. We're also going to install a second program called concurrently that will allow us to run our Angular program, our web server for that, and our JSON-based REST service at the same time. So we'll install concurrently. So go ahead and install those now. Now, as these are being downloaded, we're going to need to set up a special script inside of our package JSON to be able to launch both of these at the same time. So when you're doing modern JavaScript development for the web, it's actually quite important to understand something about Node and how things like npm and package JSON work. Because even though we're not building a Node application per se, we're using Node as the basis of all of our development tooling. And so because of that, we have to understand how all that stuff works. So to do this, we're going to add a new command here called REST. And this REST command is going to be used to actually fire up our REST service. So we'll say json-server. Watch is going to watch our db.json file for changes. We're going to tell it to run on port 3050. And then we're going to tell it to use db.json as the source of the data. So we'll go ahead and save that. Next, we need to modify our start command so that we can run our web server and our REST service at the same time. The way we're going to do that is we're simply going to say concurrently. So concurrently was an executable that was installed. We're going to run ngserve. We'll escape our quotes there. And then we're going to do that again. We're going to say npm run REST. And that's going to run the actual REST service for us down here. So concurrently, we'll execute both of these in parallel on the same terminal window. And that'll make our life a little bit easier. So let's go ahead and save our package JSON file. We'll say npm start here. Hopefully, we don't have any port errors this time. So our code is running here, loading up. Looks like everything's good. Now, our web server's running. So if we come over here and reload this, we should see that everything's working for our web page. But I can also check out my REST service by going to localhost 3050. And you'll see we have the JSON server. And we can actually come in here and we can click on cars and see our car data. We can also do all the various operations that you would do against a REST service for inserting data, replacing data, what have you. JSON server also supports SSL, and it also supports CORS for your cross-origin, dealing with cross-origin issues. So as you can see here, this is a pretty easy way to get a full-blown REST service up and running. I use this all the time when I need to mock up some REST services for development or in any of the classes that I teach. So we don't spend a lot of time trying to set up SQL Server on everybody's computers or setting up Postgres. We just simply use JSON server, and it serves as our source of data no matter what we're working with. It works out really well. Okay, so there's our server there up and running. Now, our goal here is to download the car data from the JSON server and then be able to display it on the web page. To be able to do that, we're going to need to add a model to our system that will allow us to work with cars. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new file here, and we're going to say npm, or not npm, sorry, ng, and we'll just do the G for generate, interface. Now this is going to create a TypeScript interface file. It's basically a class without an implementation, just like you would work with in Java or .NET. We're going to say car-tool/models/car. And this is actually going to go in there and create this interface. If we go into our source folder here, under car tool, let's see here. We should have our model. There we go. There's our model folder. And then there's car.ts. By the way, sometimes the file folder over here does not get refreshed when doing things from the command line. It just either doesn't pick up the change or what have you. You can always click this little refresh little circle thing right here, and it'll refresh the folder, and you can double check. I will warn you about one thing. One of the perils of working with this Angular CLI tool is that if you type the wrong thing, it can generate a lot of code for you that you really don't want. And then you have to go back and clean it all up, because it not only generates files, but in a lot of cases modifies files, existing files, as a result of your command. So kind of keep that in mind as you're working with CLI. Always double check your command before you run it. I've had a number of situations where I've done demonstrations or teaching or whatever, and I'm busy talking, not really paying attention, and I push the button, and then all this code gets generated, and then I have to go back and fix it in front of everybody. And that's a real pain. So always recommend that you double check your command before you run it. But here's our actual car file for models. There's our interface for car. Now we need to add some fields to this. We're going to say ID, and this is going to be a number. The question mark just means it's optional. It doesn't have to be included. But if it is, it has to be of type number. We'll have a make for a string. Model will be a string. Year will be a number. Color will be a string. And price will be a number. In case you're wondering where I'm getting these fields from, if we go back over to our JSON server, you'll see, oh, I stopped it actually. Let me restart it. There we go. If you go back over to our JSON server here, you'll see those are the fields that we have here on our cars for the actual REST service. Okay, so coming back over to here, we now have our car interface. Now we need to write some code to actually be able to display our table of cars. So we're going to come into our car home here real quick, and we're going to create a table. So we'll just say table. You'll see we get the auto closing tag completion. T-head, T-R, T-H, this will be make. Simply just come into here. Model, year, color, and price. So there's our 5 column headers. Then we'll come into here and we'll do our T-body. When you're working with tables, always make sure you take the time to semantically identify the actual different parts of the table. Not all rows have to be headers. Not all rows have to be the body. You could also have some rows that are a footer. It's always good to be as semantically accurate as possible when working with your HTML code. Now the first row we're going to add to this is a row that will be displayed if we don't have any data. So we'll say td call span. There's our 5. And then we're going to say asterisk ngIf, and we're going to say cars.length equal to 0. And then we'll just say no data. So this is our first piece of like Angular code inside of a template. The call span 5 is part of HTML, but this asterisk ngIf, this is a directive. This is actually known as a structural directive in Angular. And basically it's a structural directive because it's either going to add or remove this, this particular DOM object based upon this expression. So we're going to have a property called cars defined on our component. And if we don't have any cars loaded up, of course the length of the car list will be 0. So in that case, we want to display no data. So we're only going to show this if we don't have any cars loaded up. So this is going to be an expression that's understood by Angular and can be processed by Angular. And this is going to be a directive, a structural directive called ngIf. Now we're going to add another structural directive underneath that one. And this one is going to be called ng4. You will use these all of the time. So we'll say let car of cars. And then here inside of this, we're going to have our double curly braces, which you've probably seen before in Angular. And we'll just do a little copy paste there. We'll change that to model. So the ng4 is a structural directive, and it's going to duplicate the rows based upon the number of cars that we have. And so it's basically just a looping mechanism. The double curly braces surrounding this is going to evaluate the actual expressions here and then output the actual values to the content of the TD. So our car make, model year, color, and price. So let's go ahead and save that. And so now we have our actual table of data, but we're not quite done yet. The next thing that we need to do is we actually need to be able to pull in data to be able to populate the table, and we're going to be pulling in that data from our REST service. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to first head over to our car tool module. In our car tool module, we're going to be pulling in something called the HTTP client module that will actually allow us to connect to a REST service. So we'll come into here and we'll say import HTTP client module from @Angular/common. Helps if you spell your import right. common/HTTP. We're going to take this client module and we're going to add this to our imports here. There we go. So there's our client module. This will make the HTTP client service available to us so we can actually make REST service calls excuse me, against the server. Sorry about that, I had to cough for a second. Okay, so once we have our client module imported, we then need to be able to make use of the client of the HTTP client service inside of our component. I apologize, I've been battling a cold for the past week or so. And so, anyways. All right, so let's go ahead and take our HTTP client service and pull that into our car home component over here. So we're going to say import HTTP client from @Angular common HTTP. There we go. And we're also going to need to pull in our model that we created, our interface. So we'll say car from /models/car. Excellent. Now, what we're going to do is we're first going to set up an actual car here that we're going to define right here. So we'll say public cars, and that will be an array. And we'll actually initialize that to an actual empty array to get things started off. And then we need to inject our client service into our constructor here. One of the things that Angular provides support for is something called dependency injection. Dependency injection makes working with unit testing and stuff like that a whole lot easier because you can mock up things and stuff like that. And so this client service is actually part of the whole dependency injection system. And so we're going to inject that here into our constructor. We'll say private HTTP client, and then we'll make it of type HTTP client. And what this private will do is, this is shorthand notation in TypeScript. It'll make the client actually a member of the instance that we're going to create of the car home component so that we can, in fact, make use of it. Okay, so once we do that, now we need to write some code to actually pull in our actual data here. So we're going to say this.http client dot get. Now, one of the cool things about TypeScript is it also supports generics. So we can use a generic here to actually pull down data as strongly typed array of cars. So then we'll type in our URL to our REST service here. Of course, you would not want to hard code this in a real application, but for our purposes, it'll work fine for right now. So we're going to say cars, and then we're going to do .subscribe. So we're going to start off first by using an observable. We'll switch it to a promise a little bit later on to show you both. But Angular works with observables out of the box. So with observables, you use the subscribe method to be able to get access to the data. Observables don't really make a whole lot of sense when doing REST service calls, because observables with RxJS are really intended for working with a stream of asynchronous data, whereas with a REST service call, it's a single result of data that you're getting back once it has finished doing its, once it actually sends back the response from the request. Now inside of this method here, we're going to say this .cars is equal to cars. And so we're going to take the actual parameter here, which we populated with the cars from the REST service, and we're going to assign it back to here. Now this HTTP client is actually new with Angular 4.3. With versions of Angular prior to 4.3, it was actually just called the HTTP service. And when you worked with it, you had to do a lot more work. It didn't assume JSON. You had to parse stuff. There was no generic part to this. But the HTTP client is actually much nicer. It assumes JSON. It takes care of a lot of the headers and stuff and processing for you. Also, it allows you to work with generics and do this more strongly typed approach. So if we save all of this, you'll see that our stuff automatically gets processed here. Also down here, you'll see we have our REST service call being made and pulling in our cars. So if we hop over to our web browser here real quick and come back over to our demo, take a look. You now see we actually have a table of cars being populated. Okay, so now that we have our table of cars being populated, let's take a look at another part of working with Angular, and that's actually creating our own service. Right now, we're injecting a service into our component provided by Angular and then using that service to get the data. But commonly, you'll actually create your own service that will get the data and manage it, and then you'll use that service inside of your component. So let's go ahead and write some code to do that. Once again, we're going to use the CLI, and we're going to say ng g service car-tool /services/car cars. And we'll hit enter. And this is going to go and create some files for us. So if you go into the services folder, you'll see that we not only get the car service file to start off with, but we also get a unit testing file to start off with too, if you're doing unit testing as part of your project. So let's jump into our car service, and let's go ahead and start to implement that. Now, to implement our car service, the first thing we'll need to do is actually import that HTTP client stuff. So we'll say import HTTP client from @angular/common/HTTP. Boom. We'll take our client here, and we're going to inject that into our service. Now, in order to be able to inject this service into my class, I have to decorate it with @injectable. As a best practice, you should always decorate all your service classes with @injectable, but technically it's only required for services that actually receive other services. So in this case, we're receiving the HTTP client service, so we need to have it there. Now, to this service, we're going to add a single method called all, which will return back all of the cars. And we'll just set this up using a class arrow function, which is supported by TypeScript. And I'll do our car, which means we'll need to import our car as well. This. And what we're going to do here is we'll actually set this up to actually have a base URL. So we're going to set up a base URL here, and then we'll convert this to a promise. So we need to do two things here. We need to import car and set up the base URL. So we'll say import car from models/car. And then we're going to, for our base URL, we'll just set this up to be private base URL localhost 3050/cars. Okay, so when you work with TypeScript, you actually get things like public, private, and protected access modifiers. those are not part of JavaScript, just like this @injectable is not part of JavaScript. Those are things that are provided to us by TypeScript. This colon, setting the type of HTTP client, that's also a TypeScript feature. Now the import and the export class and the constructor, all of that is part of JavaScript. So when you work with TypeScript, it's good to know which parts are TypeScript and which parts are JavaScript. So TypeScript is a superset of JavaScript. So all JavaScript is valid TypeScript. But TypeScript then adds additional things, such as strong typing, to the JavaScript language through additional syntaxes. So there we go with that. So we'll go ahead and save that. So now that we've created our car service, we now need to register the car service with our car tool module so that we can make use of it. So we'll come into here, and we're going to say import cars service from /services car service. And we're going to register this with a special option called providers. So we'll say providers. So now that we've registered this with our module, we can now inject this service anywhere we want to in our application. So we'll just take this right here. We'll come back over to car home, and now instead of injecting the HTTP client, we're just going to inject the car service. So we'll say car service, paste that in. We'll come up to here. We can get rid of our importing of the client, but now we'll pull in the actual car service itself. Great. So now our car service is being imported. We now have a car services property. The next step is we actually need to configure this to use that service to pull in our data. No problem with that. We'll actually come into here and we'll just swap this piece of code out with our this.carService.all. And we have it set up to return a promise, if you remember. So we'll say .then. And if you come back over to the service, you'll see where I converted it to a promise. So you can also make use of promises if you're familiar with working with promises. All right. So we'll go ahead and save that. One thing I'll make quick mention of here real quick is that declarations is where we declare something to be a component that can be referenced in a template. Or reference something that can be referenced in a template. So not just a component, but also pipes. So over here we had our special syntax in app component HTML car home. In order to reference this here in a template, we had to have this defined as declarations. Exports allows the things that are in declarations to be used outside of this module. So for example, car home to be used outside of the module had to be exported so we could use it inside of app component HTML. And then providers is simply for registering services. Remember, services are just business logic. They don't have anything to do with like generating a template and displaying stuff. They're literally just business logic. Okay, so coming back over to car home, let's go ahead and save all this, make sure it all works, and we'll do our npm start. You'll notice that whenever I add new things with the CLI, I always stop it, add it, and restart it again. If I'm just editing existing files, I don't do this restarting process. I just let it process automatically. But I've found sometimes with the CLI that if I add stuff and I don't restart the CLI, sometimes it doesn't pick it up. So just my force of habit is I use one terminal window. I want to add something with ng, g whatever, ng generate component. I stop the CLI, add the component, then restart it. But if I'm just editing a component that already exists, I don't have to restart it. As you'll notice when I click Save here, it actually reprocesses everything again. So let's jump back over to our web browser, and let's reload. And you'll see now we're using our new service to build this instead of our other service that we were making use of. So we've got our new service populating this with data. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to create a car form. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to save a little bit of time. I prefer to live code everything. But for some of the HTML parts of the form, you don't need to watch me type out input tags. So I'm going to copy and paste a little bit of this, but we'll still do mostly live coding as we put all this together. So the next thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to create a car form. So over here, we'll just kind of scroll up a little bit here in our command history. This is where we added our last component. So we'll change this from, actually, no, we're going to do it. I take that back. I jumped ahead of myself. We're going to do it right here inside of car home component. So we're going to take our form code here, and I'm actually just going to save a little time and put this directly into here like this. We'll come into here and outdent that. That looks good. Okay. There's nothing too exciting about this particular piece of code, except I did want to make mention of form group and form control name. If you're not familiar with HTML forms, I definitely encourage you to go check out HTML and learn all the details of it. But for our purposes here, we want to focus on the Angular aspect of this. This form group is going to allow us to create a car form that's going in code that will be associated with this templated form here. This form control name will correspond to the fields that are going to be defined on this car form group object that we're going to be creating here in a second. So the only part of this that is really Angular is the form group and the form control name. And these two tied together will hook it back into the Angular component for working with the form data. Now the first thing we'll have to do to work with forms is we're going to work with something called reactive forms. Angular supports template forms and reactive forms. For those of you who are familiar with Angularjs, the earlier 1.0 version of Angular, template forms use something called ngModel to do two-way data binding. You can do that with template forms in Angular 2 and later, but reactive forms are actually a more preferred way of working with this. It avoids the two-way data binding aspect of it, and it allows you to define all of your validators and stuff like that in code, as opposed to having to put all of it inside of your template. So to put this together, the first thing we'll have to do is go over to our car tool module, and we'll need to import reactive forms. So we'll say import reactive forms module from @Angular forms. One of my most favorite parts of working with Angular is actually working with reactive forms. If you actually go to the Wintellect Now website, I have like a 4-video kind of series just on working with forms and all the cool things you can do with it in terms of validation and stuff like that. They're really, really powerful. They're one of the big reasons you want to make use of Angular. So we have our reactive forms. I'm then going to take this reactive forms module. Remember, whenever we import a module, we always have to specify it like this down here. This importing up here only imports the actual object into this particular file. This imports here is what registers it with our Angular module. Okay, so now we've got that. Now we'll jump over to our component over here. And we're going to go ahead and import here at the top. We're going to pull in our form group and our form builder. So we'll say form group and form builder from @Angular forms. So we've imported the module, but now we have to import these particular classes to actually work with it here in our application. Now down here, we'll come into here, we'll say public car form, and it's going to be of type form group. We won't assign anything to it because down here in the constructor, we're going to insert something called the form builder. So let's say private, and we'll say, let's see here, this is going to be FB:form builder. There we go. And then inside of here, we're going to go ahead and build ourselves a form. So to do this, we'll say this.carForm equal to this.formBuilder.group. And then we're going to set up a group here that corresponds to all those form control names. So you can see carForm here is applied to this. And then we've got to build a little list of all of these form control names. That's pretty easy to do. We'll just simply say make input, and then we'll do our empty string. We'll say model input, boom. Then we'll do year input like that. Color input like that. And price input like this. By the way, I'm going to stop here for just a moment. If you have questions, go ahead and start typing them in. I've received 2 questions so far. If I don't receive any more, I'm just going to keep teaching up until the stop time. But if I see a bunch of questions all show up, then I'll stop a couple minutes short so we can address some of those questions, but still cover as much coding as we can before the webinar ends here as early as 20 minutes from now. But I'm happy to go a little bit later if you guys have time to cover additional stuff. All right, so our car form is initialized here in the constructor. Now what I need to do is I need to wire up a button so that when I click the button, it'll actually add the car that we collect off the reactive form to the actual. It'll take the data off of it and then be able to add it to the REST service. So let's come into our car home component down here. You'll see I already have an add car button. This is going to call a method called add car. So we'll come into here and we're going to create an actual add car method right on our component, so add car. And then we're going to write some code here that will actually just for the moment output the value. So we'll say console log this.carform.value. So let's go ahead and save that. And let's start our service again here real quick. We should be able to type into the form now and actually see the output of the form in the console. This is always a good step to do. If you try to do too many things at once without running your code, sometimes it can be harder to debug it later on. Whereas if we divide it into multiple steps, it can make life a little bit easier. So there's our form. And we'll go ahead and type into the box here. And we'll just click add car. And you see there's all of our form input. Now, one of the questions that I just received in, which I'll go ahead and talk about here real quick. We could bind to the model. We could use something like an ng model, what have you, to be able to bind to the model and populate the model directly. The reason I'm not doing that is that my preference is to keep my form collection object separate from my actual model data. And then I prefer to actually do the mapping that I'm getting ready to do here shortly to put the two of them together. This really should not be viewed, lines 22 to 28 should not be viewed as model data. This is really just collected form data. And the model is something that's different, and we put the two of them together. If you prefer to actually bind the model directly, you're more than welcome to do that. But this is just my preferred approach based upon my experience in writing these applications. It's my preferred way of doing it. Okay, so now that I have my add car here, let's go ahead and jump over to our TypeScript code, or jump over to our service, and actually write some code to be able to insert this car into our database. So we'll say insert equals. We're going to be passing in a car object here. There we go. There's our car object. And then we're going to say this.http client.post. As you probably know, post is the actual function that we use for doing inserts when working with REST services. So post. I believe our REST service is set up to return back a number, so we'll just make the return type be number, although we're not really going to use it. And we'll say this.base URL. We'll pass in our car. And then finally, at the end, we'll say to promise. I just had a question come through about what editor is this. This is actually Visual Studio Code. It's a great editor for doing this type of web application development. So there's our insert function. Now what we're going to do is we're going to come back over to our form, and we're going to take the data that we're going to collect off of add car, and we're going to use this to actually do the insert. As part of this, once we do the insert, we're going to want to be able to refresh our table. Okay? So I'm actually going to take this method right here, pull it out of ng on init, and say refresh cars, and paste that in there like that. And then we'll actually call this.refresh cars here. Also, I'm going to set this up to return back the promise in case I wanted to chain some additional asynchronous operations off of that. Now I need to write my code here for addCar to actually take these values and produce an actual model. So the way we're going to do this is I'll actually just save a little bit of time here. I'm just going to grab this right here. As I said before, I actually produced a final version of this already for you guys that I'll push up to GitHub because I don't think we're going to get through all of the demonstrations here before we're going to run out of time. So there you go. So there's our car form values. We're simply going to grab the value off of each one of these. Let me fix that real quick and change that to model. And we're going to grab our values here off of our form, produce a car object. Then we're going to call our insert method with car. And then after that's done, we'll actually refresh the cars. So let's go ahead and verify that this code works and that we can actually add a car. So if we refresh this and we come in here and type in A and then click Add Car, check it out. There's our ability to add a car. So now we have our add car data in there. Now you might be wondering, why did it allow me to put in the letter A for year and price? Why did the code not complain about that? The reason that I was able to put in the A for year and price is that TypeScript does not run at runtime. It only runs at development time, and it takes our JavaScript code and transpiles it, or takes our TypeScript code and transpiles it to JavaScript. JavaScript, of course, is dynamically typed. So TypeScript is only going to help you with compile time type issues. It does not prevent runtime type issues. This is one of the more confusing aspects of working with TypeScript for a lot of developers, is understanding the difference between the two of those. Okay? But now we have the ability to add. So let's see here. It's 47 after. I had one more little thing that I was going to show you, and what I'm going to do is I had actually a couple more demos, but I've got one more I want to just do a quick copy paste for, so you can see an example of it, and then the other two will just be included in the final set of files that I send up to the server. And what I wanted to do is I actually wanted to implement the delete button for you here real quick. So what we're going to do is we're going to come over to car service. I'm going to have some delete code I already wrote up here. We'll just come into here and drop that in there like this. So there's our delete code. And that'll actually delete something from the actual REST service. And then what we're going to do is we're going to come back into car home, and we're going to add an additional column here called action. We'll update our call span to 6. And then down here, we're going to add ourselves a little delete button. Let me just grab the delete button here. All right, and this will actually delete our car. Of course, for this to work, we'll need to add the delete method to our component. Boom. So there we go. So you can see, to actually build out, like, say, a delete operation, I had to add it to the REST service. I had to update the template with the delete button. And then I have to have a method on my component class that actually links the template back to the service and does the delete operation. So now we've got the ability to delete. Over here, we're simply going to pass in the car ID to do the deletion. So for each car that we iterate over, that ID will be passed in as an argument. We'll reference it through the car ID parameter. And then we'll issue our delete operation and then issue the refresh. Okay, so now that we have that, let's go ahead and jump back over to our web browser real quick. Let's verify delete works by deleting A. We have an issue. Our service.delete is not a function. All right, so let's take a look here. I've got delete car, but over here, take a look. I said delete, not delete car. Your method here has to, of course, line up with the function on your component. So if you come back over to here, you'll see, boom, there's our delete car. Let's try that one more time. Hit delete, and now we've deleted the data, and we're good to go. Okay, so I had two last demonstrations I wanted to do. It was basically going to take the table and the form and move them out to their own components. But I will include that in the actual files that I push up to the server later on today. Don't expect it in the next 5 minutes or so. It'll be later on today during normal hours Eastern time. but I'll push them up. You guys will get a link to it, and then you can check out the code. So we've got about 10 minutes till the webinar officially ends. I think some of you, or maybe all of you, have a meeting after this. So I'm actually going to go ahead and just start answering questions, and I'm going to answer as many as I can, and I'll just keep going until I start seeing people leave the webinar. And then once people have left, we run out of questions, we'll go ahead and end the webinar at that point. So I think I've answered some of them as I've been going along in the session here. Let me just kind of click through these here real quick. One person asked about having the entire setup for all of this. Yes, if you're going to get into this Angular programming, you're going to have to install Node, you're going to have to install Angular CLI, you're going to have to learn a bunch of tooling. There's really no easy way to do that other than to just start doing it. So I don't know what your development teams are or what projects you're working on or what type of permissions you have on your computers. But if you want to get into this, you definitely want to make sure that you can get Node installed and then begin from there and start working with the Angular CLI. Let's see, I answered that one. That one. Okay, Async Pipe. I really don't like the Async Pipe. I see a lot of people using the Async Pipe, especially when trying to connect into observables, when trying to pull in data from, let's say, maybe like a Redux store or something like that. The problem with the Async Pipe is the Async Pipe is an impure pipe. What that means is it actually executes on every change detection cycle. Pure pipes don't execute on every change detection on every change detection cycle. The problem with executing on every change detection cycle is that an impure pipe has to check to see whether or not it has new data and then process the logic for it on every single time that change detection runs in the application. I don't have time to demo it now, but you'd be amazed at how often change detection runs. And if you're using a lot of async pipes or any other type of impure pipe, you can really hurt performance. Now, you'll see lots of examples out there, people using async pipes, but I would just say be careful with them because of the performance implications in the actual web application by using them. Okay, the question is, do we have to have the same variable named car form? Yes, you do. So over here, the fact that I'm actually calling this car form, these little square brackets right here are basically telling form group to bind to this property called car form, which is actually defined on the component itself. So those square brackets are saying take that car form and evaluate it as an actual property on the class. So it has to be named that. Now you can name it anything you want. If you want to name it something else, that's fine, but you have to name it something else in both places. All right. Okay, so we don't do the actual we don't apply business logic so much to the form data itself. To the form data, we can apply validators, and those validators can be simple ones like making the field required. We can also write our own custom validators that have additional logic to them, but the validation logic applied to the collected form data is in some ways different from the actual data that we apply to or the actual logic that we apply to our model. Now, it might be that our model has logic on it that we wrap up in a special validator that we then include in our form. That's fine. But the actual model validation does not get directly implemented into the form. It has to be wrapped up in a special package called a validator. All right, let's see here. Okay, so the ID question mark makes it optional. The question here is, if you go over to this and you put the question mark here, the question is, what's the difference between this and this? And I'm just going to be straight up honest with you. I've never put the question mark at the end before. The way you make something optional is always to put the question mark there right after the name. In fact, you can see here we're getting a little error from our linter. If I pull it up close, we still get an error from the linter. So I'm not sure where you've seen the question mark at the end. If that's an actual syntax feature, I apologize for not being aware of it. But to my knowledge, every time I've worked with optional fields in TypeScript, the question mark has always gone with the field name. Yes, so the question is, can we have validations? Yes, you can actually apply validations to form controls as well as to form groups. So you can apply validators to both. You have to create the validators, of course, in a lot of cases, but you can create them. And the nice thing about validating multiple controls, or the ability to do so, is that if one control's value impacts another control's value, for example, let's say you're building a form, and on my form I pick India, I should get a list of the states of India, not a list of the U.S. states. Or if I select select the United States, I should get a list of U.S. states and not Indian states. Well, if for some reason I have to display both lists in their entirety, I could have a validator that says, hey, if I pick an Indian state, then I have to pick one of the actual Indian states from my list, not a U.S. state or a Canadian province or something like that. Okay. All right, so how does it know how to connect to the year fields? So if you come back over to here, you'll see we have this property called year input. If you come over to car home, you'll see where I've got a form control name year input. That's how the two of them are linked together. All right, great question. All right, let's see. Let me scroll here. Okay. Which plugin do I have installed? So a lot of folks ask me about this one. I actually happened to find this one through a blog post one time, this extension that does these sizes over here. So if you come over here, I believe it's called import cost. And you can do import cost, and that'll actually tell you the size of the JavaScript file. It's kind of useful, especially if you're not sure how big some of these third-party libraries are that you're including. Of course, all of them add to the overall size of the JavaScript that's downloaded to the web browser, so it's good to know the size that you're working with. Yes, you can add Bootstrap to Angular. You can also use things like Material Design and Semantic UI as well. Those are also popular. Examples of popular sites that are using Angular. You know what? That's a fantastic question, and I do not have a list of those off the top of my head. A lot of the places that I do training at that are using Angular use them for their internal backend sites. And even if they did have a public site, I really couldn't mention the name of the company publicly. I would suggest going to the actual Angular website. I'm sure they have an example list there of companies that are using Angular. I will tell you that, so there's lots of JavaScript and web technologies out there. You can always tell the ones that are really popular by the number of classes sold, right? So for example, Vue.js is a great little library for building UIs, but you don't really sell a lot of Vue.js classes. It hasn't reached it hasn't reached a high enough popularity yet to where people are willing to spend money on training classes for it. At least not that I'm aware of. When you're working with things like Angular and React, companies buy lots of classes for those technologies. So when companies are spending money for classes on those technologies, you know they're popular. Otherwise, they wouldn't be buying them. So, anyways, I can tell you that Angular is very popular just from that standpoint. I'd probably say 50% of my year is spent teaching Angular. The other 50% is spent teaching React. So they're both very popular UI libraries and frameworks. Okay, let's see. Okay, yes, Angular does provide its own special validations. Some of the attributes are similar to the HTML5 built-in validations, but they do provide their own validations that hook into Angular's validation system. Yes, as far as I know, the webinar will be made available. I've been recording it the whole time, so you can go back and watch the recording. You'll have the code. You'll have the slide deck. You can kind of go back through and work through this as much as you would like. All right, let's see here. Angularjs Material is just a UI. It's kind of the UI presentational look and feel. It has a bunch of widgets and styles and stuff associated with it. And it's just another way of really focusing more on the visual aspect. So while Angular itself is a UI framework, it doesn't come with any built-in styling. So it tells you how to hook the styling in,
It provides you a way to have HTML, but you have to provide the HTML, of course. And then it gives you the little framework for working with your TypeScript code. But at the end of the day, you have to provide all of the content. Okay, so the question is, can we use push and splice methods to do insert and stuff? So I'm talking to a REST service. So I'm intentionally updating my backend data source with my changes. So I'm not working with just array data here. If you were to go to my network tab here, you would actually see where I'm making actual network requests. So here was an example of the, let's see here, of our, well, that was the wrong one. This is an example of a delete request. So I'm actually making network requests here to delete data from our REST service. But I did want to make one comment about push and splice. A big part of working with modern UI frameworks is doing immutable programming. In fact, Angular has a special change detection mode called push that will actually use object references to determine whether or not objects have changed. Because of that, all of your working with objects in JavaScript should be done immutably, which means using functions like push and splice really shouldn't be used for working with arrays. You should be using concat and slice and other array operators like filter and map that produce new array objects when working with arrays. That way you'll have a new object reference and you can use immutable programming techniques and improve the performance of your UI. Okay, cool. So the question is, how can we deploy Angular apps? So this is actually pretty easy. An Angular app, at the end of the day, is nothing more than just a bunch of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files. So you can basically produce a production build output of your application through the CLI. You can then just take your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript and load it up on your web server. That's it. Simply push them to the web server. There's no complicated like WAR files or other types of deployment methods you might have with languages like Java or .NET. These are all literally client-side files that just get downloaded. Now, of course, your application will probably also include REST services and other stuff, and you'll have to do whatever deployment mechanisms you use for those as part of what you're already doing. But in terms of Angular itself, it's just JavaScript. So you just put it up on the server and download it. A lot of folks envision a more complex deployment scenario because they're kind of trying to think that Angular is as complex or Java and .NET in terms of setup and configuration. Well, it might be even more complex at development time, but at deployment time, it really is just copying a file up to the web server. Okay, so to go into the JSON server and set it up to use SSL, there are some configuration options that you can do for that. I typically don't do that, so I don't have them memorized off the top of my head. But if you Google for the JSON server, you can come into here. And the developers who have worked on it have extensive documentation that explain to you how to do all this stuff. So you can come into here and check this out if you want to do your operations. All right, let's see here. You can convert a string to a number. So let's say, for example, I wanted to come into here and actually convert this string to a number. I could say string. Or I'm sorry, not string. If I want to convert the string to a number, I want to say number, and then convert it like this, and this would actually convert it to a number. Of course, if the string is not a valid number, if it can't be converted to a number, it'll come back as not a number, and you'd have to write additional code to check for that. So from a performance standpoint, using TypeScript versus JavaScript, there really is no difference. I don't recommend doing Angular development with just plain old JavaScript. You're using enough TypeScript features that trying to do it in JavaScript would be a lot of extra work. You're not going to find a tremendous amount of examples on the web of using JavaScript to do your Angular development. So it's really just better to use TypeScript. And like I said, the strong typing is a huge benefit when working with large development teams. There really is no way to undo npm or ng commands. If you run it and it generates a bunch of code and it doesn't it wasn't what you wanted, you have to go back and manually fix it. I'll be honest with you, for a long time, I didn't use the CLI. For a long time, I used to maintain my own project structures, and I would create the files manually that I needed. I did that partially so I would learn all the API stuff. I also did that, though, because I didn't like a bunch of files being auto-generated and then having to either not understand what was created or having to go back and fix it. But over the course of time, I've come to the conclusion that using the Angular CLI really does make a lot of sense, and it's a really nice tool. They've done a great job with it. It's much better than it used to be. So even though you run the risk of auto-generating a lot of code you don't want, I recommend using it. Also, if you do regular commits, you can also undo those changes by dropping out the whatever stuff you added that you don't want using your source control system. The demo project will be uploaded onto the GitHub site, and then you should be getting a link to it as well as the actual recording to be able to go back and watch this later. Okay, you could use, I have a question here about the old style ng model. Yes, you can use template forms, and there is ng model, and you can bind your form directly to your model. When I first started doing Angular 2 development before Reactive Forms, that's how I did it. I started using Angular 2 back with the Beta 2 release of Angular 2 back in June of, 2016 now? And so back then you only had template forms, but now I only use reactive forms. I don't even pull in the template forms module anymore. Okay, so I have a question here about Python. So a lot of Node stuff uses Python to help build various assets and stuff like that. The node building process that uses Python is something called Node.jip. Node.jip, to my knowledge, uses Python 2.7. So a lot of times when you're setting up a full-blown Node development environment, you not only need Node, but you need Python 2.7, and you also need a C++ compiler. So some of the Node modules that are distributed are actually distributed as C code or C++ code, and so those need to be compiled for your platform when installing. A lot of folks think that Node is just JavaScript, and yes, you do your coding with JavaScript, but there's a lot of other support tooling that can go along with it. Well, so this is using Angular 5, which just came out. So all the code here that you saw, all of the code that you just saw here is using Angular 5, which is the latest version. I literally, when we did ng new, we literally created a brand new application which downloaded the very latest versions of Angular. I can't speak to what Angular 6 is going to be like. So basically, new major versions of Angular are released every 6 months now. So Angular 4 came out last spring. Angular 5 just came out this fall. Angular 6 will come out next spring. I'm not sure what the final set of features of that will be, of course. Is it possible that there could be breaking changes in the future? Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Also, to go along, by the way, with our excuse me. Also, to go along with our Python question, we actually do have a Mastering Data Science with Python series coming out with Wintellect now in December. So you might want to check that out as well if you're into Python development. Okay, let's see here. If you don't use the toPromise in the car service class, it'll continue to just work as an observable, which is fine. You would use the subscribe method. So you would expose the observable, and then you would use .subscribe instead of .then inside of your component class. To basic steps to upgrade the Angular version. To upgrade the Angular version, you would just need to update the actual package.json file here. So if you come over here and you go down to package.json, you'd have to upgrade all of these to be for version 6, and then just reinstall your packages. If everything is backward compatible, you're good to go. If not, you'll have to make adjustments to your code. Yes, you can make component methods private, public, and protected. As a general rule, I only make them private if I'm only using them in the code. If I'm incorporating them in the template, I make them public. And of course, if you're doing some type of inheritance from like a base component and you're creating a component that inherits from that, you can then apply private and protected as appropriate for that. Okay, so let's say we had a question here about reactive forms in terms of, let's say I had a list. So let's say, for example, I had a list of people, and I want to be able to edit the people in like a grid. So I'd have a variable number of input controls. The way that I can work with that is there's actually something called a form array. So you have a form group, you have a form control, but you also have a form array, which will manage an array of form elements and be able to allow you to be able to dynamically generate that on your page. Okay, so let's take a look at our next question here. So when to use a Redux store? So Redux is a state container. It's a state management system for applications, commonly used with React, also commonly used with Angular. In fact, it's commonly used with a service called the NGRX service, which actually combines using Redux with reactive programming. Basically, you would use a Redux store if you needed a way to manage your application state, which basically applies to just about every program. If I'm building an Angular application, I'm almost always going to make use of Redux and NGRX to manage the data for it. Of course, I'm now bringing in a third-party library to do that. My application will become more complex to work with. You'll have to have a good understanding of reactive programming and a good understanding of Redux. Neither reactive programming nor Redux are massive APIs in and of themselves, but when you combine them all together and combine them with Angular, do not underestimate the difficulty of writing applications that way. It's a great way to write them, but it can be very challenging to work with as well. You do not need to learn AngularJS to use Angular 5. You can start directly with Angular 5. I don't recommend trying to learn Angular 2 or Angular 4, going back to older versions of AngularJS. However, I will tell you that you do want to make sure you understand how HTML works. Make sure you understand how CSS works. Make sure you understand how JavaScript works. Yes, we're using TypeScript, but ultimately the TypeScript gets transpiled to JavaScript, and TypeScript is nothing more than a superset of JavaScript. When I teach my classes, and I ask the class, how many folks in the class actually found Angular or React to be hard or found JavaScript to be harder? They always find JavaScript to be the hard part. Learning the APIs for Angular or React, doing HTML, not a big deal. It's knowing JavaScript. And the problem is most people don't view JavaScript as a real language. But I'm telling you, as a guy who's done all types of programming over my 20-plus year career, I've done tons of back-end programming, tons of database programming, tons of front-end programming. JavaScript is definitely one of the more complex languages. A lot of folks think Java is super hard. Java is easy compared to JavaScript. You just have to believe me on that. I teach Java developers all the time, and they're excellent at Java, but they really struggle understanding all the concepts of JavaScript. And the problem is JavaScript, while it's named after Java, has nothing to do with Java. In fact, if there was a language out there that was very similar to JavaScript, it would be Lisp. And that's because JavaScript is primarily a functional programming language. It operates on a completely different paradigm than what Java does. So when you get into JavaScript programming, don't assume that because you've done Java work, it's going to be super easy, or because you've done C# work. It's a totally different way of looking at the world. And so you definitely want to make sure you make time to really learn JavaScript. That'll be probably the biggest, most important thing you could do to be a great Angular 5 developer. Okay, yeah, so each project has its own node modules folder. So you don't have to, you don't create that. When you say npm install, npm actually goes in there and creates that node modules folder for you. The useful plugins that I use for development for like Angular applications, let's see here. I always have installed, let's see, some good ones. I like to use ESLint. That's my linter for JavaScript. I like to use HTML hint for linting my HTML. Markdown lint for linting my Markdown. Let's see here. Sass lint for when I'm working with Sass files. TS lint is another one. VS Code icons. A lot of folks ask me about my cool icons that I have over here. Those are all the result of VS Code icons. I like those a lot. Okay. The interface that you saw me use in TypeScript is similar in concept to interfaces that you would use in C# and Java. What you'll find a lot of times in TypeScript and JavaScript programming, well, yeah, in both actually, is that we don't care about the origin of the object, we care about the shape of the object. You see, in C# or Java, when you're using interfaces, you're defining just the shape. You're not determining the origin. The origin would be some class that implements that interface. In the world of JavaScript, though, in TypeScript, we don't really, for the most part, we really don't care about the origin of data objects. We just care that they have the right shape. The object could be created with a class, but it could also be created from JSON, or it could be created from an object literal on the fly. Because of that, we don't care where it came from. We just care that it has certain properties. So in a lot of cases where you might have used a class in C# to define your model, in TypeScript you'll use an interface. That way you're not limited to where the object came from. You just have to make sure that it has the actual shape of properties and stuff that you're looking for. Okay, so the type of the interface fields is just to give it strong typing, so that later on if you try to, so let's say for example, I've said that price is supposed to be a number. So if I come over to here and I say car.price, all right, you'll see I get my nice little IntelliSense here, equal to test. You'll see that my editor is going to complain saying, you know, test is not a number. There is also something called the AnyType, and so you can assign the AnyType to something, or you can assign anything to the AnyType. But here we're actually trying to assign a string, and so you're going to get an error if you try to do that. Okay, so there's two types of forms. There's template forms and there's reactive forms. Template forms are basically all of the logic and stuff is all placed into the template, and you use ngModel to take your data object on your component and connect it to the form. In that case, you're really connecting your form directly to the model itself. There's reactive forms, which the forms are now basically generated more or less by code. You have little markers in the template to connect it into the code, but basically the generation of the form is driven by code, not driven by the template. For reactive forms, you don't bind directly to the model. Instead, you produce a form object, and then you write code that takes the data off the form object and puts it onto the model. Okay, any suggestions to study Angular 5? I would start with components. Start with the Angular CLI, start with components. I'm going to be pushing all of this code up to the server. You can start by looking at my project code. You could actually enhance my project. You could add in the ability to edit components. You could add in routing. You could add in unit tests. You could add in a Redux store. You could expand out my simple application to incorporate more complex stuff. The best way to do it, though, is just to get started writing code. It'll be difficult at first, especially if all of this is new to you. It can be really tough. Another thing you can also do is I have my series on writing Angular applications up on Wintellect Now. So you could actually go to Wintellect Now, sign up for the courses there, and you could actually walk through the whole process of setting up an Angular application. I also have some courses up there working with React and Redux and other stuff like that. We have a bunch of new courses that are getting added all the time in topics like machine learning and data science and stuff like that. I'm actually working on 2 course series right now, one on SQL and one on Python. And then I've got a second one on Python with the whole data science stuff that I'm working on as well, and that'll get released out in December. But we have lots of different cool things going on there with Wintellect now. We also have some additional JavaScript stuff that's going to be published out there towards the end of the year on a variety of topics like GraphQL and some relay content and things like MobX and all types of cool stuff. Lots of exciting stuff happening at Wintellect now. There's also another thing that I want to give you here real quick. Let me jump over to here. If we go to GitHub, Microsoft Community Content. So if I click on this, and I'm going to take this link and actually post it directly into the chat window here for everybody. So everybody should get this link as well. On Microsoft's GitHub site, there's actually a link to something called Web Frameworks. Jeff Procyse here, by the way, he's one of the Wintellect guys. He's the guy who runs Wintellect now. He actually had me create some tutorials on Angular and React. So now these were created earlier this year, so it's not like the latest Angular 5 stuff. But it has all the key stuff that you would need to know about to become an Angular developer. So if you click on this Angular one right here, and you click on the hands-on session, you can actually walk all the way through building a complete Angular application. Now, this tutorial does not use the CLI, but you could actually follow the steps in the tutorial, do the CLI stuff along with it, and you could actually go through, and I wrote all of this, and you can actually go through and read all of my explanations for how to put all of this together. So this is another great resource you can take a look at as well in terms of putting an application together. So that link is pasted into the chat window. This is another great resource for learning Angular. Also, too, if you have any questions, you're more than welcome to email me. Let me put my email address in the chat window as well, eric@t4d.io. You can send me emails on Angular, React, JavaScript. I'll do my best to get back to you. Obviously, we've had hundreds of people attend this. I can't get into big, long, in-depth explanations, but I can probably point you in the right direction. If you've got a question on something, feel free to reach out to me. Okay. Let's see here. So if you want to add one more value to the cars form but don't want to add a control to the form, I mean, you could add another field, but you wouldn't be able to collect data on it unless you actually, added it to the form. So you'd have to add it to the form to collect data on it and manage it. Okay, so ID question mark means the field is optional. So for example, when I collect, let's say, a new car, I don't have an ID yet, so I don't have that ID field populated. Whereas price doesn't have a question mark, so it's required. If you're going to have a car object, it has to have the price field defined on it. Yes, you can upgrade the code from HTTP to HTTP client fairly easily. There's a few changes you have to make. If you actually go to Wintellect now, I have a whole video on that actually. I published back in September that actually shows an example of working with HTTP services and using the old version and using the new version. So you can actually check that out if you want to. By the way, the old HTTP service is deprecated as part of Angular 5. So you should see warning messages in the console of your web browser if you're using the old service with Angular 5 telling you that you need to upgrade. Let's see here. Any other easy questions we can take care of? Of course, we're getting to the end. All right, so Jquery. So the thing about it is that in modern web development, we don't really use things like Jquery. The days of developers directly manipulating the DOM have kind of faded away. If you do need to incorporate an existing Jquery plugin or something like that into your Angular application, to do that, you'd have to get into all the lifecycle methods of a component and then interact with the DOM at certain points in the lifecycle of the component when it's allowed. The problem, though, is when you start doing that, you've now introduced the dependency of having an actual web browser DOM into your application, which may or may not be what you want to do. But as a general rule, you're better off finding Angular-enabled components that aren't making use of things like jQuery. All right, a couple more questions on this whole import thing. The reason I'm able to see the size of the imports is because of the import cost plugin that I have installed in my Visual Studio Code. All right, let's see here. Yes, yeah, everybody here should receive a link to the recording as well as the GitHub site for where the content for this is going to be hosted. If you do not receive a link by tomorrow, so give us time here on the East Coast today to get that posted up. But if you do not receive a link by tomorrow, just email me at my email address and I will send you the link personally. But just wait until tomorrow to do that, because I won't have the link until later today when you guys are hopefully at home sleeping. All right, let's see here. Okay, question was, are there any UI builders like drag and drop features to build Angular interfaces? I can't say 100% there aren't any. I'm sure somebody out there might have created one where you can drag and drop. But as a general rule, when it comes to web development, everybody codes it by hand. If you're using web forms or something like that, like an older version of Visual Studio with web forms, you might be used to the whole drag and drop thing. But I can tell you in modern UI programming using all these JavaScript libraries, people hand code it all. There is no dragging and dropping of components and stuff onto pages. Like I said, I'm sure there's some tool out there that's somewhere that someone's created that can do that for you. But in terms of writing these enterprise applications, typically developers code all of that from scratch. Angular 5 is really not that much different from earlier versions of Angular. Most of the new things in Angular 5 all have to do with internal performance improvements, some improvements to the CLI, stuff like that. Not a tremendous number of new language features. There are some, like that HTTP client thing becoming the one that you're going to use. But as a general rule, the Angular API as a whole has stayed pretty stable, especially since the spring of this year. I'm sure there will be more changes coming out down the road with things like Angular 6, but with Angular 5, it's kind of more or less the same thing as you were using before with Angular 4. Okay, so we're not giving the car an ID value on the client side. It's kind of like any type of database scenario when you insert records into a database. The ID is auto-generated. The JSON server is generating the ID for us behind the scenes, and then when we refresh our list of cars, we get back the actual ID that was created as part of that. Let's see here. Okay, I have a question here on interpolation as it relates to event handling. So I think what you mean by the question is this. How are these values here being set? Like, for example, in this case with let car of cars, you're going to see this car ID here being populated as part of this string of text that we have here. Also, maybe you might see something that looks like this with a $ event. So Angular, as part of its template processing, is going to be processing these arguments here and populating them with values based upon the data being used in the template at that point. So for example, this car ID is going to be populated from the car from our array of cars. This $ event is going to be the event object that's produced by the button when you click the button. Okay, so that's what you see going on here in terms of this data being populated and then invoking the delete car button. Okay. All right. So let's see. Yes, there should be a recording and a GitHub link will be sent to you guys. Suggest ebook for future learning. Okay, so here's the deal with books and JavaScript development. Things in the JavaScript world change so fast that it's really hard to find books out there that can keep up with it. Because literally, the moment the book is released, it's basically out of date. The best source of information is always going to be the documentation. So going to the Angular documentation, the React documentation, that's always going to be the best place. But there is actually something called ngbook, which I'll put into the chat window. ngbook was originally created for the original version of AngularJS years ago. But there's a newer ngbook that's for the newer Angular, and they actually do a really good job of keeping it up to date. It's a pretty big book. It covers a lot of stuff. It covers a lot of stuff on Redux in addition to Angular as well. At least the last time I checked the table of contents, it did. If you want to check that book out, you can go check it out, and it's a book that you can get like a subscription to, so you buy the book, and then you get the updates and stuff to it, and it's pretty nice. IDE that I recommend, Visual Studio Code. I don't recommend using things like WebStorm or IntelliJ. Atom is okay, but I think Visual Studio Code works much better with TypeScript. I used to use Sublime, but the Sublime team kind of went on vacation and like never came back. And I think they've released some recent updates, but for a long time there were no updates coming out for it. And so when Visual Studio Code came out, and it had great support for TypeScript, this is my go-to editor for all of my development, to be honest with you, for the most part. Unless I'm doing something that really requires a specific IDE, I use this for everything. Let's see. Yes, I use cross-origin stuff because the REST service was running on a different origin than my web server was loaded up from. The JSON server supports cores out of the box. If you wanted to use cores with your own REST service, you'd have to set up your REST service to send back the proper headers to be able to support that. Let's see here. All right, best way to learn this stuff is to go watch the videos, go take a look at the tutorial, and more than anything else, write lots of code. The only way you learn stuff is to write code. Just keep adding features to what we've already started here. You'll break stuff along the way, but then you can figure out how to fix it, and that'll really help you learn how to do Angular stuff. Also, another thing you can do too is I don't know all the details of your organization, but you can also do Angular training. We have lots of Angular trainers that can do online training, in-person training, and we can actually do all the stuff that you've seen in this webinar. We can do this as part of a larger class. So just kind of envision, instead of doing this for 2 hours, we did this for 5 days. And then we go through all the details of working with Angular. Students are able to share their screens and do presentations and class debugging, all types of cool stuff. Lots of coding, of course, along the way too. And so you can do stuff like that to learn more. Okay, so Angular, the actual Angular markup code that you see inside of the templates, for example, the asterisk ng4, stuff like that, that is not really valid HTML. It's not intended to be valid HTML. The HTML that's produced by the Angular system is valid HTML, but the HTML that we type into our template is not. Okay, it's going to be stuff that's specific to Angular. Okay, so the constructor versus ng on init. The constructor runs earlier in the lifecycle process. Ng on init runs later. It just depends upon what you're doing. If you're writing code that's dependent upon the component being fully ready and up and running, you're going to use ng on init. If you want to initialize an object ahead of time, something like that, you can do so inside of the constructor. I could have set up that car form code that you saw over here. I could have done this inside the constructor, or I could have done it inside of ng on init. It was just my preference and choice to put it in the constructor. Once you become familiar with all the lifecycle functions and stuff of a component, you'll kind of figure out where to put things just based upon that. Okay, so for the list of VS Code extensions, I'll include that list in the README file for the GitHub repo so you can install those. Okay, so the language and tools node, or the question is the list of language and tools needed to build Angular apps. Node, Python, C++, Angular CLI, Visual Studio Code, and Chrome. So this just standard development tools is all you'll need. Okay, there are lots of differences between previous Angular versions and the latest. I'd say probably the biggest thing is if you go back to Angular, all the way back to AngularJS, is in this modern version of Angular, we're using, everything's built around components. In terms of Angular 2 through Angular 5, it's really just an incremental build on the API. There's really no big, huge, major feature changes other than massive performance improvement between Angular 2 and Angular 5. So Angular 4 was a drop-in replacement for Angular 2 with lots of performance improvements. Angular 5 has even more performance improvements. All right, let's see here. Yeah, so if you want to do like SEO, you'd have to do server-side rendering. So you'd have to render your page on the server and then download a complete, fully rendered out page as part of the as part of doing SEO. So you'd have to write code that detected it was a search engine coming to the page, not a regular user, and then send down a server-rendered page that had everything set up for you. To reinstall the Angular CLI, or to reinstall the packages, you just do npm install. So if you had to delete node modules, you could just type npm install, and it'll go back over the internet and re-download all the packages again. Let's see here. Yeah, so comparing Angular to Java is kind of like comparing apples to oranges. Java is a server-side thing. Angular is a client-side thing. I will tell you that if you're used to building server-side web apps, like with JSP pages or stuff like that, that is going away. Everybody is moving towards building client-side web applications. So Java really is at this point nothing more than used for building REST services, not for building actual UIs. So that would be my comparison that I'd offer you for that. So Java is great for back-end stuff, but I wouldn't use Java to build my front-end UI using JSP. I'd be using Angular, React, something along those lines. Let's see here. All right. The standard way of setting up a project is to use this Angular CLI stuff. In terms of node projects in general, that's a whole other thing we could get into that we're not going to right now. But for Angular projects, you can use Angular CLI. Yes, you can use regular Visual Studio to do your development. You can use things like IntelliJ from JetBrains. I'm of the opinion the development experience is not as good. The development experience is way better in Visual Studio Code than it would be in those editors. Question we had on what is linting. Linting basically goes in and verifies that your source code is following whatever style guidelines and stuff that you've you've put in place for your organization. So, for example, the Angular CLI produces an initial style set that you're supposed to follow, and then it goes through and enforces that in your editor through the use of the plugins. I don't know when the template will have all the IntelliSense in terms of the Angular stuff. There might be some plugins for that I'm just not aware of. Obviously, you saw that when I was doing the HTML coding, I had some cool stuff happen in terms of code generation and stuff, but there is no, I'm not aware of at the moment, but I also haven't recently looked for any IntelliSense in the templating either. Okay, so keeping the Angular app up and running in production really has nothing to do with the server. Once the Angular app has been delivered, just through a web request, HTTP request, it runs locally on the client. There's nothing you have to do on the server to keep it up and running. All of this Angular stuff is totally client-side. There's no server-side part to it. The only server-side part I had here was the JSON server, and that was just to provide me with data, but the JSON server, other than providing data to the Angular app, had nothing to do with the Angular app itself. It was just my source of data. Okay. No, Angular is not installed via NuGet packages. You would have to use Node for all of this. So when you move into the Angular development world and React and stuff, you're moving into Node. You're not doing things using the same old NuGet packages that you did with your .NET stuff before. Okay, so when you start with Angular, just get in to start writing just JavaScript and TypeScript code. Even if you don't, even if you only know Java, you just got to get in to start writing code. That is the only way to really learn any of this stuff, is just to start writing code. I remember when I first learned Angular, I literally got Hello World up and running, and I was super excited. And then I said, okay, I have Hello World. Now I want to do this. And I went and figured out how to do whatever it was. And that's really the best way to learn, is to write code. Use videos, use books, use tutorials to kind of get you going down the right path. But at the end of the day, you just have to write code. That's the best way to learn all this stuff. You do not need to learn Angular 1 to learn Angular 5. Let's see here. The debugging. You could just debug directly in your web browser. That's really the best way to set up debugging, is just to debug stuff directly in your web browser. Angular CLI produces all of the oh, what are they called? Oh, I'm forgetting the word. It's the source code. When it transpiles the source code and it links the original source code back to the actual transpiled source code, you can make use of that. So, or let's hold up. I'll show you in Chrome here. All right. So if we come into here and you go into your sources here, all right, and if we load this up, we should be able to get a Webpack file here. There we go. Our source, that's right, source maps. We should be able to get our source map code that we can take a look at here, and I'm trying to find it in our generated code. Source, here we go. So you take a look here, you'll actually see our original TypeScript code that we were working with. And if we come into here, we should be able, for example, in our ng or not our component, let's go to car tool and go to car home. I should be able to come into car home here. And for example, see my on init, I should be able to set a breakpoint here with my source map. Reload this. All right. And it should catch my breakpoint here in my web browser. So I can actually debug in my TypeScript code the actual transpiled code that's running behind the scenes. So if you look at it, this is the transpiled code. This is all the code that's produced from all of our coding that we did. And then this is the actual code that we typed up. And so source maps allow you to map from your original source code back to the transpiled source code. All right. Let's see. Let's see. I'm not aware of any Google Maps component library changes as they relate to Angular 5. You'd have to check that out with whatever libraries you're using to tie the two of those together. Let's see. Let's see. Okay. Question real quick on session management, and then that'll pretty much do it for us for the webinar. There is no like automatic built-in session management in the sense that the entire application is running in a web browser. So the only session in the web browser is the end user. If you're talking about managing the session on the server, well, that's the same cookie-based or token-based sessions that you've been using for years with your programming on the back end. So, so session management is not that big of a deal from the Angular perspective because the application is only running in one place. Remember, the Angular code does not run on the server. It only runs in a web browser. So it's only running for that one particular user. Now, of course, if you're accessing data on the server, you'll want to have the person be authenticated and have session data from that perspective, but that's nothing more than just the same old cookie-based session stuff that you had before. Okay? Okay, so we had a few other questions in the list that either do not directly apply to Angular, or I don't completely understand what you're asking in terms of the question itself. Here on the East Coast, it's like 5:45 in the morning, so who knows? Maybe I'm a little tired or what have you. So if you'd like, send me an email to this email address right here, eric@t4d.io. If I did not answer your question or you'd like more details on the question that you did ask, and I did attempt to answer. In case you can't see the chat window, I will throw it up here on my screen, eric@t4d.io. Don't hesitate to email me. Like I said, we had almost 300 people join us this morning, so or this afternoon for you guys. So if I'm a little slow in responding or I give you a very short answer, just understand I'm answering a lot of emails. But you're welcome to email me there. I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you have. And I think that pretty much does it here for the webinar today. I appreciate everybody, I guess, hanging in for an extra 45 minutes here. It's a great question and answer session. I appreciate everyone's engagement and involvement in asking all the questions that you did. Also, thank you very much for all of the kind words and thank yous that you guys offered in the questions. I really appreciate it. So I wish you guys all the best with your future Angular development. And don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have any questions related to JavaScript or programming in general, and anything especially related to Angular or tools like React and stuff like that. All right, so you've got my email. Feel free to reach out to me, and I wish you guys all the best. We'll go ahead and end the webinar now. Have a great rest of your day and a safe trip home this evening.